We have seen large global VCs invest on the continent, and we are continuing to see them investing. Some of them hired local teams, and some of them raised an Africa bucket specifically for the region.
Welcome to VC Evolve podcast, conversations about the future of VC. Our guest today is Hisham Halbouny, GP at P1 Ventures, a seed stage firm focusing on African tech founders. Prior to P1 Ventures, Hisham was a partner at Man Capital, where he led global private market investments, including Uber, Bolt, Airbnb, and Fairmarkit. He is on the board of several high-growth companies in Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, the US, and India. And listen to this. It's what his team says about him. He may claim he's not a die-hard soccer fan, but he would always ask for a break every time Egypt is defeated in an international soccer competition. Hisham, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ahmed, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Okay, before we get into this podcast, I have the most important question ever. What's your favorite soccer team?
I cheer for the local Ahli team in Egypt, and I'm a Chelsea fan. But again, I'm not a die-hard soccer fan in general, just for the record.
Okay, you say Chelsea in the UK?
Yes.
Man, this episode is over. It has to be Liverpool, man.
No, to be honest, I only watch football to keep up with the kids, right? And the two boys, just to keep the conversation flowing with them.
I love that. Okay, Sham. So P1 Ventures focuses on Africa. And on your website, you say African entrepreneurial talent is more widely dispersed across the continent than venture capital funding. And we're here to change that. How are you changing that?
Thanks, Ahmed. Look, this is a really good question, and this is core to our thesis and what we believe. We really believe that talent is equally distributed and capital is not. We are conduits of that capital. Our job is to try to find the best founders, the best teams, and the best talents and back them. And when we say back them, this is obviously capital, but also other support that we can give the founders. And that typically includes, supporting on talent acquisition, supporting on market expansion, and supporting on introductions to further growth capital, given that we invest at the seed stage. So I think the continent at large has so many talented people, and the continent has many daily problems that we believe technology is the solution to fill in this gap. And this is where we try to have a small impact on how the continent evolves and how it grows.
So I wonder what sectors or industries are more active in Africa. What do you focus on? What verticals?
We are sector agnostic, but the tech companies on the continent are solving real daily problems, and we're solving for access, right? Access for most of the people living on the continent is scarce. And that cuts across all industries and all sectors. That's why we believe by applying technologies to those industries allows users, whether they're enterprises or retail, to get access to the basic goods and services. If you take a step back and put a few numbers next to sort of sectors, so fintech has been the biggest recipient of capital over the past few years. And obviously, because 70% of the population, and I'm talking about the entire continent, right? 70% is either un or underbanked. So this obviously provides a huge pool of opportunities where you can create solutions to democratize access to financing needs. So we have portfolio companies that do that by offering collateralized loans for consumers, B2B payments, formalizing some of the informal ways that people used to, for example, save, like they call local jam'iyas or saving circles.
Yeah.
So we have portfolio companies that do that as well. If you look at healthcare, which is another sort of vertical, healthcare and insurance is a vertical we're close to as well. A third of the global disease burden sits in Africa, and less than 2% of the world's doctors reside there, right? So there's a huge access constraint here that we believe technology will be able to allow for that bridge to happen. E-commerce is another one. Most people in tier 2 and tier 3 cities don't have access to what you and I and people living in tier 1 cities will have access to. So e-commerce is really becoming an enabler to that. So the list goes on and on. So that's why we are sector agnostic, but we tend to look at businesses that are capital efficient and tend to tread on the asset light side of things rather than asset heavy side of things.
And what countries in Africa do you focus more on? Because most of the investors in the Middle East, they say we invest in MENA, and MENA means Middle East and North Africa, and this includes basically the Arabic-speaking countries in Africa. But it seems you're focusing not only on that, you're expanding your coverage, right?
Absolutely. When you look at Africa, there are the big four, and we spend more time maybe on three of them, which is Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. The fourth one is South Africa. We're not very active there, while we made a few investments there, but we think it's less homogeneous with the rest of the continent in terms of problems, in terms of penetration rates, so on and so forth. And then we focus on other emerging hubs, and we pride ourselves to go off the beaten path. So we invested, for example, in Algeria back in the day in a business called Yassir, and we were one of the early investors there. Not a lot of people would look at Algeria for VC investments. This company now grew to generate significant revenues. They've expanded to 6 countries. They serve 8 million customers on a daily basis. So again, we go where the best entrepreneurs and the best founders are. So the emerging hubs we are currently focused on will include Francophone African countries. That will include Morocco, Algeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal.
Wow, that's quite a lot. And correct me if I'm mistaken, I read that Africa had a VC boom in 2020. Since then, things have been changing. Can you give us like a quick overview of the market cycles that Africa have seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good also point you hit on. And if you take a step back, look at 2015, you have less than $300 million invested across the entire continent. Okay, only $300 million. Fast forward to 2022, this number hit $6 billion of funding. Now, funding globally obviously took a downturn. Africa is also experienced that downturn, but even with that downturn, you're talking about first half 2023, you have almost $3.5 billion invested across the continent. So that shows you that the evolution is happening. It is not stopping. It might slow down a bit, but again, it is happening. The digitization process is not going to stop because you cannot unsee what was revealed. The impact of digitization is massive. So you can always look to LATAM as a preview of what's to come on the continent. And again, they went through a very similar inflection point, but maybe 10 or 8 years ago. If you take another metric, Africa has about 12 unicorns that were created. And what's more interesting is not the number of companies that are worth $1 billion plus, but also the time it has been able to achieve those valuations. This number shrunk from almost 12 years to 3 to 4 years in some cases. So funding is still coming in. Valuations and investors are believing in the story, and this is reflected in the valuations of the companies. And the evolution of the founders and their ability to build companies at scale and unlock value is also enhancing quite rapidly. You're finding now repeat founders on the continent that are building for the second time, and maybe in some cases the third time. And the last thing is you're finding also talent that are building product locally, but they are exporting their products globally. For example, we have a company that we backed recently, Gameball. This is an Egyptian company, that's Egyptian team, phenomenal engineers, and they sell their product, which is a SaaS solution for gamified loyalty and customer retention, and they sell it to 72 countries. And they're displacing competition in the UK, in Germany, in Latin America, in the Philippines. So again, the quality of the talent has significantly improved. And we'll see more and more as you find more proof points and more success stories, teams will get spun out of those companies and creating their own businesses.
That's very impressive. And I wonder if VCs in Africa are following the traditional Silicon Valley or US VC model, or have they developed their own VC model now? Do they have customized VC model that fits the needs of African startups and investors?
I believe that the model is universal and it works everywhere. And VCs by default will tend to go back to the whole power law. Very few companies, outlier companies, are the ones that are going to make you returns. And I think that's the path that the US followed, Europe followed after that, India, LATAM, and I think Africa is no different to that. The question becomes, more on the founder side, and what solutions are they building? Are they adopting the solutions for the local needs and the local nuances? And are the VCs supporting the execution, or the founders actually executing on those strategies? So VCs play a bit of a maybe more hands-on role in some instances, working alongside the founders, because again, there are still gaps in the ecosystem where you need all the players to maybe roll up their sleeves a bit more and pitch in.
Makes sense. And we see that in all emerging markets. And the African scene is emerging and growing very fast now. Have you seen any new innovations in the VC model itself internationally, not necessarily only in Africa?
Yes, but not necessarily at scale. You're seeing different variations, the platform approach or more traditional approach, and there are many that sort of are still on the traditional trajectory. But there are others that are trying to disrupt themselves and ourselves, because also our industry will need to evolve at some point. So there are a few funds that are out there that are using more machine learning ability to actually leverage that to be able to source deals, to assess deals, and underwrite them. I still believe there is a huge human element to what we do. So yeah, these models, they will continue to evolve, and I think VCs will also evolve as an asset class and as managers. And we need to actually start thinking about this. How do we equip ourselves for it? But I think ultimately, it still is, the human element is huge, and I think will continue to become a cottage industry, irrespective how you scale it.
And I know in Egypt there are multiple accelerators. I don't know about the other countries in Africa. How is the accelerator scene in there?
There are accelerators in other countries in North Africa. Egypt obviously is one of them. You have Tunisia, you have Morocco. I just came from Morocco actually, from an accelerator. And it's partially also supported by government initiatives. So again, governments are taking interest in the evolution of what's happening in the technology space, and they are supporting their ecosystems through accelerators and some investments. Yeah.
Do you see an active scene for angel investors in Africa? And I want to also ask about equity crowdfunding, because now in the US, equity crowdfunding is booming. There's more than 70 platforms in the US only for equity crowdfunding. How is the both angel investing and equity crowdfunding in the countries we focus on in Africa?
Equity crowdfunding is not, you don't find it that much. It's not that prevalent. Angels have always been a big part of the ecosystem actually building. As GPs, we started off as angels on the continent and investing there, and that sort of evolved into building what we're building. We were a bit more intentional that we're doing this to build a firm. We're seeing super angels. And at some point, obviously, with the hype, a lot of the angel investment turned into family offices investing in those companies. But those we're seeing retreat a bit. With the downturn and a high interest rate environment and the macro scene, you're finding that some of the tourist investors are retreating, which obviously decreases the amount of froth in valuations. So we're seeing companies now being valued at much more reasonable entry points. But angels and the active angels, we continue to see them contribute, and they've always been a positive contributor to the wider scene.
If I move to the other end of this cycle, which is the exits, what are the potential exits for these new startups in Africa? Are there, in those countries that you focus on, are there active IPOs, tech IPO markets, or do you depend more on an international or a global player to come and acquire those companies?
That's a great question. I'd expand that to Africa and the Middle East as well. I mean, most of the exits that happened in the tech space has been through strategic M&A. So these are global players that are coming and buying out companies in the region. What's evolving as well is like you're finding also some consolidation. So existing startups that have become larger or hit scale velocity are acquiring smaller startups, right? As a roll-up play and an expansion strategy. But M&A has been the predominant route for exit over the past few years. You have had some liquidity events or exits through public markets, but again, the continent is large. You're talking about 50 plus countries, and they don't have a single stock exchange that they can list on, right? So what happens is ultimately large countries that have a relatively larger capital market tend to provide some exit routes. So you can take the Egyptian Stock Exchange, for example, where Fawry was listed and it hit a peak of $2 billion valuation. That's great. It provides you the exit route. But again, those windows in those countries tend to come and go. I think the liquidity through IPOs will come. LATAM went through a very similar process. India's been through a similar process. So I think, the ecosystem will continue to build out itself. But for now, you have some countries that provide you with liquidity through capital markets like Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa. And you will have global strategics buying out regional champions and local or regional champions buying out smaller companies.
How do you see the future of the VC industry in Africa over the next maybe 5 to 10 years? Do you see international players coming into the VC scene? Like we've seen, for example, some US VCs opened up shop in China, in Sweden, in Germany. Are they coming to Africa soon? What do you think?
Yeah, look, another great question. Overall, very optimistic about what's happened. Again, you're talking in a span of, since 2015 till now. I walked you through the numbers, so it's all trending in the right direction. It might take a bit slower, and I'm glad actually, that this whole global slowdown kicked in as the African ecosystem is getting built. I think it's going to build a tougher type of and more resilient type of investors and founders. And that's another interesting statistic. 70% of the growth capital that came into Africa came from US and Western VCs. So we have seen large global VCs invest on the continent, and we are continuing to see them investing. Some of them hired local teams, and some of them raised an Africa bucket specifically for the region. We're seeing this happen also on the continent. I can maybe sort of think of maybe 5 or 6 global VCs that have now a dedicated Africa strategy. I think you will see more of that. You will see more consolidation on the early stage side because you have many seed funds, but I think most of these will die out. Again, the fundraising environment is not an easy one. And I think you will find some consolidation at the early stages. And again, most of the capital has been raised at the seed/Series A. We're seeing more homegrown VCs that are targeting the Series B onwards, which obviously adds to the war chest of founders being able to raise locally from funds that are dedicated to the region. And recently, you've seen some sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf that typically were not large investors in the African continent. We're seeing those come in also and invest. So the ecosystem will continue to evolve, will continue to attract more seasoned investors. We're very optimistic about where this is all trending.
I learned a lot about Africa and the startup and VC scene in Africa. Hisham, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you so much for having me.